to refute that, the rich man in Luke
Luke
16.
16. Yeah.
And that's not a mythical story, by the way, as these.
It's
And
not a
by the way,
parable.
brothers and sisters,
Right.
it is the rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16, a true story.
Since they're saying that this story is literal, can we read this story as a literal story?
I like that.
The way
Let's do that.
let's assume it's not a mythical story, it's not a symbolic story, and follow through with what would that mean?
Yeah.
All right, let's get into this thing. That was hilarious, but I mean, we took it as they said to take it, right? Quite literal. But let's be honest with this, right? Let's look at this. I'm going to share some thoughts, and then I'll share a slide I wanted to share as well. By all means, brethren, jump in at any moment. Going back to the context, because remember, context will always kill their bad doctrine. Isn't that what we were told? And context is king. All right, chapter 16. Go to verse 14. So let's look at the context a little bit. Go backwards a little bit, Brother Jay.
To which verse?
14.
14. Okay.
Who were the people present?
The Pharisees.
Yes, but look at this now. And the Pharisees who were covetous.
Yeah.
In the New King James, it says lovers of money. Was there one like that in the story?
Yeah.
There was one like that in the story, wasn't there?
The rich man.
Right? So Jesus takes this opportunity in front of these individuals and gives a story that directly relates to them and their hypocrisy and their covetousness, right? And he takes this opportunity and gives them this story. When you read this whole thing, this whole story that he gives them, it becomes quite obvious that it's not a literal story, as our critics like to say. We just saw that already as we broke down each text, right? It's not a literal story for very obvious reasons. But can we say that it's a parable? Can we use the word parable? The critics like to say that the critics like to say that you can't use the word parable because it doesn't say the word parable in the story, right? I'm going to share with me this something on the screen here, if you don't mind, Brother Jay. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, it's a little small.
If you can make it full, that'd be better. But
let me see. Is it bigger now?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. All right, and I have this PowerPoint I can go ahead and give to everybody, but look at the surrounding context. The surrounding context of this story. First, in chapter 16, verse 19, look at the similarities. There was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. But go back a little bit to chapter 12. And he spoke a parable unto them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man. Notice the similarity between the terms.
Right.
Chapter 13. And he spoke a parable, a certain man had a fig tree.
It's the way he tells the parable.
It's the way he talks. There was a certain rich man which had a steward, verse chapter 19. And he added and spoke a parable, a certain nobleman. Chapter 20. Then began he to speak to the people this what?
Parable.
This parable, a certain man. Notice that in every time he speaks a parable, he begins the same way. A certain man, a certain nobleman, a certain man, a certain individual. And that is exactly how he begins in Luke chapter 16. A certain
good point.
And it's very interesting that you're showing all these from the same book.
Yeah, that's right. It's all Luke. Yeah.
From the exact same book. Exactly. From the exact same book. So is this a parable? It quite evidently is a parable, even if the story does not itself use the word parable. Because all of the stories around them begin in the same way this story began, and those are called parables. And two, because as you read the story itself, it is evidently not a parable.
And not literal. Not literal.
Not literal, thank you. The beggar Lazarus was carried into Abraham's bosom. Obviously, that's symbolic. People are asleep when they die, but this man is alive. The Bible says that they are in their grave asleep. Is Abraham sinning by committing necromancy in heaven, which means communicating with the dead? Right? Cool my tongue. That's obviously not realistic. And in the condition that the man is in the midst of all that fire, you can't logically have a rational conversation as we read in the story. Nobody can. Because not only is that fire, but that's the fire of God. And so nobody can have a conversation that's rational and normal and logical the way he was having there. It's unrealistic to take this and say that this was a literal story.
Okay, I want you to get to the part that I said is a sucker punch. That's the last of the parable. So you want to bring it back up?
Yes.
Okay, so he's got these people on the ropes, man. He's telling them a story, and they all know the story. like I said, I found it in the Jewish Talmud. I found it in other Greek sources. This is a kind of a common story because it's this great ironic story. You know, the guy who's got it all in this world goes to hell, while the guy who suffers in this world goes into Abraham's bosom. It's always that way. They call it something else when you're in Egypt or whatever, but it's still the same story. It's this ironic story. And they're all listening to the story and they're saying, man, I get this. You know, they're following with them. And like you said, just in the paragraphs before, he had addressed these people who have plenty in this world and that's their focus. So he's given them the story that they're, yeah, we know where this is going. We know where this is going. And then suddenly he turns the tables and he has a different punchline. And the punchline is that it's not about the reward of the suffering man getting better. It's about the guy who has a chance in this life to respond, whose whole motivation is to have more riches. And so he's talking to them about that. And then it says there is something here that is about the state of the dead. He wants to be able to go back and speak to these brethren so that they don't end up in this place where he's suffering. Okay, so here we have this line between death and the world up here. Can they go back and warn? No, there's a great gulf fixed. You can't go back. So it does teach us something about the state of the dead. If somebody comes back, if the phone rings and they say it's somebody who's dead, you know it's the wrong number. It's not the one you think you're talking to. So he gives them, he makes it clear that you're not going to expect that. But then he says, well, for I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, lest they also come into this place of torment. Abraham saith unto him, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. Okay. When it comes to the understanding of what happens when you die, if you go to Moses and the prophets, what's it going to tell you? Are Moses and the prophets going to tell you when you die, you go to Moses, to Abraham's bosom? Are Moses and the prophets going to tell you you can communicate with the dead? No. If you study Moses and the prophets, they already explained this is a parable.
That's exactly right. That's a great point. Basically, he directed them to the scriptures, Moses and the prophets. Now
there is something more here, because he also told them, you search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and they are they which testify of me. So you, instead of going to the scriptures to find a means to reach up to God, they should show you the Christ who is to come, who is the means to go to God. One more thing, and that is, in all of the other parables that I found, they never name the rich man. But here, Jesus assigns a name that we recognize. Who's Lazarus?
Lazarus was the person that he was about to raise from the dead.
Well, actually, I think by this time he has already raised him from the dead. Are you thinking that it's time-wise? Anyway, ultimately, what we do know is that Lazarus dies. Does Lazarus go to Abraham's bosom, get called back? Does he have any testimony about that? No. But what we do know is that when he rose from the dead again, these same people who are listening to this story wanted to kill him to clear out that piece of evidence on Jesus' behalf. They would rather kill the man who came back from the dead than to listen to him, just like they said here. If somebody came back from the dead, would they listen to him? No. And they absolutely proved that case. They wanted to kill him.
It's almost like a prediction, right? Like Jesus was warning them. Had it already happened, it's like Jesus was telling them, this is you, by the way. You refused a literal Lazarus who came back, and then or taking place in the future. The point remains the same. Go ahead. I think somebody wanted to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to.
Oh, and Randy after Jason, then Randy. Go ahead.
No, I'll go after Randy. Go ahead, Randy.
No, I actually wanted to see where you were going to see if you were going to catch it. Go ahead,
I was going to go to John chapter 12.
Go ahead, and then I'll go after you.
So John chapter 12, this was the real case. So we know, like John chapter 11, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, right? I am the resurrection of the life.
Right.
Jesus weeps, and he asks, where have you laid him? And then Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. So that's from verse 38 onward. But then when you look at chapter 12, right, you'll see this situation, a plot to kill Lazarus.
Come on, preacher. Come on.
All right.
Go there.
It says this. It says, much people of the Jews therefore knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus also to death. Why? Because that by reason of him, many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. So this is really that point that if you don't believe the scriptures, you won't even believe, even though one rises from the dead. And so it's like, to name Lazarus in that parable was just Jesus just miles ahead of everybody else's thinking. Like it's just genius.
Yeah, so brother, you kind of went there, but also, you know what I was thinking? I was thinking in regards to obviously the fact that when Lazarus wanted the crumbs or whatever the right
off the table.
Yep, you guys kind of already see where I'm going. You talk about the Phoenician woman, right?
She's a little puppy.
Right, exactly. And she says, and when Christ said it's not meat to, give food from the master's table, she said, well, even the dogs pick up the little crumbs, right? And so we can see that, the parable is really an understanding that God's people, especially the Pharisees at the beginning, with so much rich knowledge and information. But Lazarus represented, because of the fact that he was outside the gate, represented the fact that these were Gentiles or outsiders or outcasts that were trying to get in, that they didn't want to let in. And they wanted to keep the information, or in other words, their riches, or their knowledge, their understanding, the wisdom of God to themselves. Right? And so it's a beautiful parable.
Yeah, he hits it on more than one level.
Oh yeah. And so, it's really, and it falls in line of kind of what you're talking about, Edwin, as far as the chapter, as far as, chapter 16, as far as talking to the Pharisees in different places. So it's just a continuation that, you guys have been so blessed with information, but yet those who are dying literally on the outside, in Lazarus' case, he died, you choose not to care. And it's only when you get rebuffed and you start, possibly reconsidering your ways, not because of the fact that you actually care to share, but because of the fact that you just don't want to endure the punishment that comes with what you have done. So I thought the parable was a very, I wouldn't say straightforward, but it was a beautiful parable if you actually understand it. That's it.
That's right. And I wanted to just make a few more comments on this as well, on Luke 16. I want to support something Pastor Kevin had said earlier about how this story is very similar to other stories that were in the cultures of the time, even among the Jews at that time. So I'm going to share my screen. For some reason, I can't upload it, so I'm just going to go ahead and share it. Can you guys see it right there?
Yep.
Hopefully it's not that small. Here you will see, I took this from the Babylonian Talmud. Notice the similarity. And here it actually called a parable. It says, a parable to what is this matter like? To a king who made a feast for his servants, and a poor man who came and stood by the door and said to him, give me a bite. I don't know if Pastor Kevin, this is the one you were thinking of?
Yeah, well, this is a good one. Yeah.
And by the way, anybody in the chat, if you want this PowerPoint, again, mention it in the chat and contact us at info@adventdefense.com. We'll send it. So here in the Babylonian Talmud, you have a story already familiar to the Jews at that time. All right. Now notice this. Fourth Maccabees 13 mentions one is a similar story as well. It says, "Let us not fear him who thinks he is killing us, for great is the struggle of the soul and the danger of eternal torment, lying before those who transgress the commandment of God. Therefore, let us put on the full armor of self-control." You can almost see the similarities in some other texts in the Bible, right? For if we so die, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will welcome us. And then back to the Babylonian Talmud, in this tractate, it says, today he is sitting in the lap of Abraham, our forefather. So, it's like Pastor Kevin has says, what Jesus did is take a story that was familiar to the people at that time and modified that story. And after modifying that story, he then teaches a lesson out of that story. He's not taking a literal story, but he's taking an already fictional story, an already a story that's already a parable, modifies that, and then teaches an important lesson off of that as well. So just wanted to make that point about that as well, how this was nothing new to the hearers. There's another point I wanted to make, but did anybody want to add to that or add something else?
Good, clear.
Okay. I wanted to respond to one more point that critics use regarding Luke 16, and then I'll open the floor for the rest if there's any other thoughts. Right here in this slide, I'm showing this text for a very specific person. And if you haven't seen my response to Alan Parr, I mean, this was about 1.5 years ago at this point, but take a look at it when you get a chance, right? Alan Parr and other critics like to say that the story in Luke 16 is literal because it's real names being used, like Lazarus and Abraham. We already looked at that. The reason why, in the context of what Jesus, in the context of the events at that time, the reason why Jesus uses real names is because there was a real Lazarus, right, who was actually going to die and be resurrected, and they still wouldn't believe. So then, therefore, they try to kill Jesus. But nonetheless, the idea that if a story has a literal name, it's therefore a literal story and not a parable. That's adding to the chapter, right? That's adding your own preconceived idea.
It's an assumption.
Because it's an assumption. There's no rule in the Bible that says that if there's a literal name being used and therefore it's a literal story. The Bible doesn't say that. That's not a rule. That rule was made up by the critics. Anyway, here's an example of a parable in the New Testament where actual literal names are used. Here in Ezekiel 28, 2-4, it says, "Son of man, there were 2 women, the daughters of one mother, and they committed whoredoms in Egypt. They committed whoredoms in their youth. There were their breasts pressed, and there they bruised the teats of their virginity." So, and then, of course, you're going to see how it treats it as the parables in the New Testament, like how in Matthew 13, Jesus gives a parable, then he later explains it. Here we have a parable that's then later explained. But notice the real names. And the names of them were Ohila and the elder, and Oholiba, her sister. These are actual names. "And they were mine, and they bare sons and daughters. Thus were their names." Now here we go with the explanation. "Samaria is Ohila, and Jerusalem, Oholiba." So here we have a parable in the Old Testament that's then explained like parables typically take place in the New Testament. Again, Matthew 13 is an example, using real names. So just because a real name is used doesn't necessarily mean it's not a parable.
Clear.